You guys have a lot of burning questions, and I'm going to try to get through at least 13 of them today. So we're going to cover what to do about deer in your garden. We're also going to talk about my real honest thoughts on the green stock planters and get into a bit of a health update today. Let's start off simple. The first question that I have is, what did you do before this for work? So I actually really love to talk about this because I feel like my work, all the things that I've done for work, have really informed what I'm doing now. So one of my very first jobs was actually working at a farm stand on an organic farm, and I was just selling the produce. I wasn't growing any of it, but I interacted daily with the farmers. I saw how hard they were working, and I also noticed how much people were disconnected from the sources of their food. And this was something that I became very passionate about. I'd have people come in and say, where did this pepper actually come from though? And I'd say, oh, the field behind me right here. And they wouldn't believe me. And I think it's a big part of why we don't really see the value in our food. We don't see the purpose of finding food that's locally grown. After that, I actually bounced around to a couple of corporate jobs. So I did work at an insurance company, a really large insurance company, and I think I picked up some amazing customer service skills there, which have served me very well. Dealing with the public over the phones was kind of like putting me through the ringer of interacting with people in general and communicating in a way that's clear and concise and easy to understand, even on complex issues, which has definitely translated into the comment section over on social media. Simultaneously, while I was working this corporate job, I started my own business as a wedding and portrait photographer. So this kind of fed into the art side of things. I had been doing photography since I was a teenager and taking on apprenticeships and trying to learn as much as I could. And I was working on that business part-time while working full-time in the corporate world. And I was able to make the transition over to trying to do this full-time, although it never really got off the ground where I wanted it to, because the moment I started to build momentum in my wedding photography business, the pandemic happened. It ended up being a blessing in disguise because I pivoted into more commercial photography, and I was also doing gardening at the same time to try to alleviate some of the mental distress that I was feeling around that time, and I was documenting it on Instagram. So I was really able to meld kind of the customer service aspects of what I had learned, my passion for food, my passion for gardening, and my art into this new career as a content creator. And it's just really cool to be able to look back and see how much things have changed, but also how much those things led me to where I am today. All right, our next question is, are you vegan? I am not vegan. I have been vegetarian for something like, oh my gosh, 20 years now. Yeah, because I was 11 when I started eating vegetarian, and that was honestly just because I had this moment while we were grilling burgers where it was right here because I'm still living on my parents' property, but the fields behind us where we have these beef cattle, I just had this moment of like, we were grilling the burgers and looking at the cattle, and now I have a much more nuanced perspective on this. I think those cattle are extremely well treated. I have tons of respect for the work that they're doing, even though I don't eat their meat myself. I do think that buying local meat is the best way. However, at the time, I just kind of had this more simple mindset of like, how can we be eating these animals? And what are your thoughts on the green stock planters? I have been growing in green stalks for about 2 years now. I have 2 green stock planters in the same color but different textures. And they do have a bit of a learning curve, which I think is really important to note. However, if you were to ask me, like, out of all the different places that you grow food in, which one would you recommend I start with, I would always suggest the green stock planters. They are having a pretty good seasonal sale on these right now, so I'll make sure to link those down below for you. They have sales on them all the time, so if you're watching this and the sale is not going on, you can just sign up for their newsletter and they'll let you know the next time the sale is happening. Because these are container gardens, they don't have access to the macronutrients that are in the ground. We need to treat them like container gardens, so they require a bit more of a heavy hand with fertilizing, and you need to make sure you're orienting them properly so that they either have sunlight on all sides, because of course you're growing plants on all sides of this planter. You can fit 30 plants in the spot size of like a doormat, but half those plants aren't going to grow well if you don't either have the spinning base so that you can turn it regularly, or full sun on all sides. So mine do face the back wall of the greenhouse, so I do have to turn those every single day. But with the spinner base, it's literally just like, as I'm opening up the doors to the greenhouse, I'll give them a half turn. As I'm walking by, I just give them a half turn. So it's really not become like an inconvenience in any way. And they can be really hands off because they don't really have any pest pressure since they're elevated. They don't really have any weeds since they're containers. And you can also add on the Bluetooth timer so that you don't even have to really water them. And this has pros and cons. So if you do have chronic pain or chronic fatigue or some other physical limitation that prevents you from being able to consistently garden, a green stock is going to make it so that you have a lot more room for error. However, it's also so hands off that I feel like you're not as connected. You're not getting the same rewards necessarily that you do from working a garden that requires a little bit more attention. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And in certain seasons of my life, I absolutely prefer that. And I think it's a great way to maximize space, especially if you're in an area where you cannot grow a garden. You maybe just have a little balcony spot that you can grow plants. This will let you grow full-size plants. And I get this all the time. People are skeptical that you can really grow anything larger than like an herb in this. The pockets are 10 inches deep. You really don't need any more soil than that to grow a full-size vegetable plant. Even the raised beds behind me, you really only have about 10 or 11 inches of soil depth because I have those sub-irrigated planter trays underneath as well. And they are lush, they are full. So you can do tomatoes, peppers, squash in these. Of course, if you're doing a larger plant, it's a good idea to be strategic about how you're orienting them. And we'll get into this more. I'm gonna do a whole fall planting video on the green stalks as well. What do you think is the most underrated plant and why? This is a really polarizing one. So I think the most underrated plant is a ground cherry. These are also called husk cherries. It kind of looks like a tomatillo in that it has a papery husk and a small kind of cherry tomato shaped fruit inside. But that's where the similarities end because this is a sweet berry. It is not a tomato. It is not savory at all. It has kind of a tropical flavor that people either love or hate. I think they're really easy to grow. They're very large, kind of bushy plants. And you know when they're ready because they actually just drop straight to the ground. You don't pick them off the branches. They're not ripe until they fall to the ground, hence the name ground cherry. This is the one that I get probably every single time I put up a question box, and I've never been able to really answer it conclusively because it's not something that I deal with very much in my own garden. And that's how do I deal with deer in the garden. So just to give you a little bit of background, so we have a river that actually goes, it's a few miles out that way. And then this way we have swamplands and kind of a wet wooded wetland area. So the deer have a natural crossing point here where they come through my garden almost every single day. And our neighbors will even text us and be like, the deer are out, because they'll kind of like hang around in the yard for a few minutes before they make their way down to the river for the day. To be honest, I don't see a lot of deer in my garden and I don't see any damage from deer in my garden. Now, we've had situations where at one point there was an old abandoned tennis court in this field behind me and a deer got trapped in there. Of course they're going to do damage and they're going to eat if they're trapped in a pool area or some kind of fenced in area where they have no other option but to eat what is around them. And they're also going to do a lot more damage if your food is the best food that's available to them. And I think I'm kind of lucky in that our area has a lot of things to offer for deer outside of my garden, so they don't need to eat from my garden. However, if you do have deer in your garden, I've crowdsourced a couple of suggestions from you guys, from people who have actually dealt with deer in their gardens. So you want to look into, of course, fencing is going to be your best option, but I know that's not practical for a lot of people. I've also heard that some people have really good luck with garlic powder and cayenne powder and just kind of sprinkling that around every once in a while. Of course, if it rains, you're going to have to reapply. But I've heard garlic powder in particular, you don't need very much at all to deter them. So I'd imagine some kind of a garlic spray would also have a similar effect. And I'd be curious if mint might also work as well, because I'm sure there's definitely companion plants like marigolds and things that could help mask smells and deter animals like deer. But again, it's just not something we deal with here. I don't honestly deal with a lot of pests in general because my beds are elevated, and that's another one of the pros of them. I do have all the raised beds that I'm using in my garden linked down below. If you're dealing with a lot of pest pressure in your garden from things like bunnies and chipmunks and squirrels too, an elevated bed is also going to keep them away from your plants. What are your thoughts on netting? The birds are getting all of my fruit. this is tricky. So I've heard mixed things about netting. As a rule, I don't use any netting of any kind in my garden because of the possibility of birds or other small animals getting trapped in it. It just has never been worth the risk for me. I just assume that I'm gonna lose about 30% of anything that I plant to wildlife. Our garden is a part of the ecosystem, and I think a lot of times new gardeners come into it with this assumption that we need to fight back against that, we need to kind of keep nature out, and I've always been of the mindset that it's better to just accept that they're there and that we are a part of that ecosystem too. Are you into video games or Dungeons and Dragons? I actually really used to be into video games, and I've played Dungeons and Dragons a few times and I enjoyed it. I honestly just don't have the time. Like, I'm one of those people where I have tried a lot of different hobbies, right? Like, I love to try new things. I'm very crafty. I spin my own yarn. I knit, I crochet, I read, I bake. But I'm also like a serial hobby experimenter. Like, there's very few things that I've landed on that have kept my attention through many, many years. Gardening, of course, being the number one, but with video games specifically, I just honestly don't have the time. If I do play a video game, it's typically in the winter. Sometimes if I have like a cold or something and I just need to stay in and snuggle up. But right now, where I have kind of limited free time, summer is really the busy season for my work. When I have free time, I'm usually just reading a book. What's going on with your health? Did you get a new diagnosis? So I have been alluding to this for a while now and kind of just processing it internally and figuring out how much I wanted to share. So I'll just kind of get into it briefly here because it doesn't really make sense to do a whole separate video on this, but I think it's relevant and it's important to talk about, especially because I've made it a big part of my content to tell you guys what I'm going through with my arthritis and my Graves' disease and how that's affected me in the garden, and just kind of a raising awareness, because I think for so many of us, we just want to feel seen, and the garden wants to feel seen too, right? Like, we're here to kind of just watch and observe, and if what I'm going through can help make somebody else feel less alone, then I'm more than happy to talk about it. But this kind of has been a little bit extra difficult for me to get into, only because it's really personal. Like, it's very kind of intimately personal stuff. So for the last few years, I've been struggling with some unexplained infertility as we've tried to start our family. And it's very hard not to feel like a failure when you're going through something like that. And we are conditioned as women to assume that this is part of what makes us kind of useful. So I've had to spend a lot of time unpacking that, and also a lot of time just kind of figuring out what's going on, because I've gone through the testing and nothing was wrong and we're unexplained. They kind of just dismiss it and they're like, okay, move on to these fertility treatments. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I totally support that for anybody who feels that that's the right path for them. With my anxiety and with a couple of other financial things that have been happening, we haven't had the option to really just go down that road, and it hasn't felt right for me because I knew something else was happening and I just didn't know what it was, and I needed to get to a place where I could trust my gut enough to advocate for myself and say, no, something else is happening here. And so this past year we've been exploring that a little bit more, and I've found some new providers that are really taking the pain that I'm having seriously for the first time in literally 20 years. And we've discovered that I also have endometriosis and adenomyosis. So this is a whole body disorder. It's characterized as a reproductive disorder, and it is probably the cause of the infertility that I've been struggling with. And unfortunately, because women's health is about 40 years behind most other kind of health research that's happening, there's a lot of misconceptions around this, and it usually takes people with these conditions something like 7 to 10 years to get a diagnosis because their pain is not taken seriously. A lot of times women's pain is just not taken seriously, and that has been the case for me. So I have been really struggling with accepting that because my pain wasn't taken seriously, it has delayed my ability to start a family, and perhaps, I mean, we don't know this, but perhaps even prevented it entirely. And unfortunately, a lot of the treatment options that are available are really limited. They pretty much just put you on hormones, which I do not want for a number of reasons, or they offer you surgery. So we're at a point right now where we've decided to go forward with surgery. And this is really scary for me for a couple of reasons. I'm really scared of surgery in general, and I'm really scared as a self-employed business owner of taking time off, because the recovery for this is about 6 weeks, and that's something that I cannot do during the busy season with my work. So I don't have a lot of details right now. It's probably gonna happen sometime over the winter, and I will update you guys as we go, but I know that I'm not the only person going through this. I know infertility in general affects 1 out of every 8 couples, and this is something that isn't talked about enough. It's deeply stigmatized, and it's very isolating. And I hope that just by sharing my story, I can help someone out there feel just a little bit less alone in this, because I have been really going through it for the past few years, and having to show up here and put on kind of a brave face, it can feel really inauthentic. So that's part of why it's felt so important to kind of share this part of my life with you guys, because if I'm gonna be showing up here multiple times a week and telling you about my life, that is a huge part of it. On to something a little lighter. Do you prefer using tea leaves from your garden, dry or fresh? I actually think that it's kind of both for me. Like, I have been really enjoying the ritual of coming out here and having a moment where I just pick individual herbs fresh for a cup of tea. However, we've got a long winter coming, and the idea that I can lock these flavors and powerful nutrients away for the winter by drying them, of course, appeals to me as well. So it's a little bit of both for me. How do you water your garden? I actually water my garden 4 different ways. And first of all, I want to say the best way to water your garden is what works best for you. I'm trying all of these different methods so that I can demonstrate them for you and explain kind of the pros and cons, because this is kind of like a test garden, right? Like, we're trying things to determine how accessible they are and the ways in which they might be able to help you. So behind me, you wouldn't know it, but they're actually self-watering, and they have rainwater harvesting built into them. So there are trays that are food safe plastic built into the underside of these raised beds. So as it rains, water runs through the soil and collects in those trays. Now there's also a filling tray, so if it doesn't rain enough, I can fill them up. I believe it holds about 25 gallons of water per bed. And what this does is called sub-irrigation. And this allows the plants to draw water up from underneath, from the roots. Bottom watering is just better for plants in general. You're keeping the fungal diseases at bay because the surface of the soil is staying dry, and you're also encouraging the plants to develop stronger, deeper root systems by watering from underneath. And you're losing way less water to surface evaporation. So this is a really hands-off method. And I mean, the beds were beautiful enough before I knew that that was an option, but once they said I could add that, I was just blown away. Having these has made a huge difference in how much time and how much water I'm using in the garden. I also use the Oyas. We have a whole video about the 2 different types of Oyas that we use, which I will link for you here. But basically, you can make one for $5 with a terracotta pot, or you can use this system that I've been testing out this summer and absolutely loving. That's kind of like a hybrid, because it uses rainwater, and it also uses kind of like drip lines to connect multiple Oyas in a row and refill them for you automatically. And that is, I would say, is my favorite system that we've used so far. And I also have a retractable hose reel that I use when I need to surface water if I have new plants or seedlings going in that I'm trying to germinate. How many tattoos do you have? I'm at 18 right now. Most of those are on this one arm, and I'm counting even little tiny ones. So I have one more big piece to do right here. Let me know if you have any suggestions for this, because all I have right now is like maybe a fern or something, because I want it to trail onto this part of my hand just a little bit. I want the sleeve not to just have a hard ending. That's why I did it the same way with this upper part too, where it kind of goes up over the cap of my shoulder. I have my lady on my thigh, and I'm going to be doing a crow piece on the other thigh, and then I need something big here. Probably will have to do with cats, and something big here, and then that's all I have planned. If you have tattoos, you know how hard it is to stop once you get started. What fertilizers do you use and why? So I need to start start experimenting with this a little bit, but it's what I've been doing has been working so well. I have this Stonington Blend granular fertilizer from Coast of Maine, and I've been putting that on like every 2 or 3 weeks, which I use a lot more than the bag actually says to use because my gardens are container gardens and they get really, really hungry. Veggies are so hungry. So I do fertilize really heavily. I like the granular because it's very easy to apply and fast. And I love Coast of Maine, so you can't go wrong. What's your favorite accessible gardening hack? Another impossible question because I feel like it totally depends on what your physical limitations are, right? Like the first accessible gardening hack that we really introduced was the elevated raised beds, and we were testing so many different versions of those, including the green stalks count too. I would say the green stalks are probably the most accessible of the accessible versions that we have, but there's so many tools. So I do have a whole video here that I can link for you guys where I talk about some of my favorites, and we're also always doing shorts where we're trying to feature like 5 new ones as often as possible. Okay guys, so it got a little bit heavy there for a minute, but I think it was a fun Q&A in the end. I love your questions, so make sure to check in on the community tab because that's where I'll be asking for future questions for future Q&As going forward. We'll be doing some of these in the greenhouse as it cools off. Thank you so much for gardening with me and being a part of my life too. It's been a very rewarding job and I'm so thankful to have you here with me. Happy growing.